It was August 31st, 1993, and John Stanfa sat in the back seat of his bulletproof Cadillac, watching the streets of South Philadelphia with eyes that had been trained to spot danger in the mountains of Alpine. Sicily more than 50 years earlier, the morning rush hour traffic moved slowly along the Schuylkill Expressway, ordinary workers heading to their jobs, completely unaware of the brutal war being fought right in their own city. The 52-year-old mob leader had every reason to be on edge. In the weeks leading up to that morning, the streets of Philadelphia had been soaked in blood as a younger group of criminals had begun challenging his power with guns and bombs. Sitting beside him was his 23-year-old son, Joseph Jr., a young man who had been reluctantly pulled into his father's dangerous and violent world. Behind the steering wheel sat a Vietnam War veteran named Freddie Aldrich, one of the very few men that Stanfa trusted completely to guide him safely through the dangerous waters of Philadelphia's criminal world. The armored steel body and bulletproof windows of the Cadillac offered a certain level of protection. But Stanfa understood well that in the mob war now tearing Philadelphia apart, no place was ever truly secure. The attack happened with absolutely no warning at all. A blue Dodge sedan pulled up alongside their vehicle, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop completely. The sharp crack of gunfire broke through the quiet morning air. One shot rang out, then another, followed by a wild burst of bullets. Rounds slammed into the reinforced glass, cracking it into a spider web pattern, but not breaking through. Then one bullet found its way through. Joseph Stanfa, Jr. cried out in agony as a round ripped through his jaw. Blood splattered across the leather seats inside the car. Freddie Aldrich, drawing on the instincts he had developed during his years of military service, did not panic or hesitate for even a second. He yanked the steering wheel sharply, pushing the heavy armored Cadillac toward the guardrail and using it as a shield to cut off the attacker's clear line of fire. Then, with an extraordinary level of focus and calm, he hit the gas and steered toward the nearest exit ramp, driving the massive vehicle off the expressway and out of the danger zone. The blue Dodge chased after them for a brief moment, then suddenly veered away and disappeared into the flow of traffic, just as sirens began echoing in the distance. John Stanfa, who had somehow walked away without a single scratch, held his bleeding son tightly as Aldrich pushed the car toward the hospital as fast as it would go. In that terrible moment, covered in his own son's blood, the Sicilian mob boss must have realized deep inside himself that this war was going to end very badly for everyone involved. But this was not the beginning of John Stanfa's story, and it certainly was not the end either. To truly understand how a man who had grown up in a peaceful little Sicilian village ended up being hunted down on a Philadelphia highway, we need to travel back to a small island sitting in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, where ancient traditions of honor still controlled how people lived, where silence was considered a virtue and revenge was seen as a personal duty, where the word mafia was only whispered quietly, if it was spoken out loud at all, in the mountains of Sicily. On December 7th, 1940, Giovanni Stanfa took his very first breath in the old hilltop town of Caccamo, Sicily. The entire world was already deep in the middle of a devastating war at that time. Hitler's armies were sweeping through country after country across Europe. Mussolini had tied Italy firmly to the Axis powers, and Sicily, that critical island sitting right at the center of the Mediterranean Sea, was soon going to become an important and fiercely contested battleground. But in Caccamo, daily life went on much the same as it always had for hundreds of years before. Caccamo sits perched on top of a hill in the province of Palermo, dominated by a massive Norman castle that had been built all the way back in the 12th century. The town is made up of limestone houses that cling tightly to the steep hillside, their shuttered windows looking out over valleys filled with ancient olive groves and almond trees. In 1940, it was a place where tradition mattered far more than any kind of modern progress, where loyalty to your family was the highest possible value, and where the old Sicilian code of omerta, the sacred code of silence, was handed down from father to son the same way a valuable family treasure might be passed along through generations. Giovanni was the youngest of 4 children born into a family that, by several accounts, already had deep connections to the Sicilian mafia. In those days, the boundaries separating legitimate society from organized crime were not always clearly drawn in Sicily. The mafia had originally grown out of protective societies in the 19th century, stepping in to fill the empty space left behind by weak or completely absent government authority. By the time Giovanni entered the world, the Cosa Nostra, which translates to our thing, had its fingers wrapped around everything from farming to politics. Growing up during wartime in Sicily shaped the young Giovanni in powerful ways that would echo through every chapter of his life that followed. He witnessed scarcity and hardship up close. He saw what it meant to survive against the odds, and he came to understand deeply how important it was to build and maintain strong alliances with the right people. He absorbed the lesson that real power did not come from governments or from police officers, but from men who commanded genuine respect through their strength and their intelligence. He came to understand that family was absolutely everything, that loyalty was the same thing as life itself, and that betrayal was the worst possible sin a person could commit. In 1943, when little Giovanni was only 3 years old, Operation Husky brought Allied military forces crashing onto the beaches of Sicily. The Americans arrived, and with them came a controversial strategy to help govern the island and root out those who had supported the fascists. The United States military government turned to a familiar institution for help, the mafia itself. Powerful figures like Don Calogero Vicini in Villalba and Lucky Luciano, the American gangster who had been deported back to Italy, helped the Allied forces navigate the complicated landscape of Sicilian society. In return for that assistance, the mafia's power and influence, which Mussolini had worked hard to crush during his rule, was effectively revived and given a kind of unofficial legitimacy. This was the Sicily that shaped Giovanni Stanfa's childhood years, a place where the mafia was not merely tolerated by the community, but was actually viewed by many ordinary people as a completely natural and even necessary part of the social order. The young boy absorbed lessons during those early years that would serve him well decades later on the streets of Philadelphia. He learned the critical importance of rispetto, which means respect. He understood the absolute necessity of having powerful and reliable friends, and he mastered the subtle art of appearing humble and modest on the outside while quietly exercising genuine control over everything around him. By the early 1960s, Sicily itself was beginning to change in significant ways. The economic boom that had followed the end of the war had started to reach even remote and isolated towns like Caccamo, but it also carried new tensions and conflicts along with it. The first major mafia war erupted in 1962, a brutal internal conflict that was sparked by bitter disputes over who would control the increasingly profitable drug trafficking business and the enormous opportunities that came with the booming construction industry in Palermo. On June 30th, 1963, an event took place that would send shockwaves all across Sicily and would ultimately have a direct impact on Giovanni Stanfa's entire future. In the Palermo suburb of Cioccola, a car bomb went off, killing 7 police officers and members of the military. The Cioccola massacre deeply shocked the entire nation of Italy and triggered a massive government crackdown on organized crime. Thousands of people suspected of being connected to the mafia were arrested. Trials began moving forward in courts across the country. The Italian government, for the first time in many long years, appeared to be genuinely serious about confronting and dismantling organized crime. For men like Giovanni Stanfa, who had recently gotten married and was beginning to think seriously about his future, Sicily was suddenly starting to feel like far less welcoming a place than it had been before. The traditional ways of doing things were now under real threat. Law enforcement was no longer willing to simply look the other way as they had done for so long. It was becoming clear that the time had come to search for opportunities somewhere else entirely. In 1964, at the age of 23, Giovanni Stanfa made the single most consequential decision of his entire life. He would join the many millions of Italians who had packed up and crossed the ocean to America in search of a better and more prosperous life. That same year, he married Nicolina Gialdi, and together, the young couple set their eyes firmly on the distant shores of the United States. When immigration officials processed Giovanni Stanfa upon his arrival, they asked him what kind of work he did. Bricklayer, he answered. It was not entirely untrue. He had real training in construction work, which was a common trade throughout Sicily, but his genuine credentials, the personal connections and deeply acquired knowledge that would turn out to be most valuable to him in America, could not be written down on any official government form. Giovanni Stanfa stepped off the boat in New York City in 1964 with his young wife. A small amount of money, and something that was worth far more than any amount of cash. Direct family connections to the American mafia. His brothers and his brother-in-law were already living in New York, and they were fully initiated members of the Gambino crime family, one of the 5 powerful families that controlled the New York criminal underworld. Through those family connections, Giovanni was introduced personally to the legendary figure of Carlo Gambino himself, Carlo Gambino, the quiet and unassuming boss who would eventually come to be known throughout the underworld as the boss of all bosses, had a sharp eye for recognizing potential in people. This young Sicilian newcomer had exactly the right background, exactly the right attitude, and most critically, exactly the right bloodlines. Gambino maintained close and important ties with Angelo Bruno, the boss of the Philadelphia crime family, who had just recently secured himself a seat on the mafia's powerful ruling commission. Gambino arranged for Stanfa to be transferred to Philadelphia, where Bruno could put a dependable and trustworthy old-world Sicilian to good use within his organization. And so, by the late 1960s, Giovanni Stanfa, who would soon become known simply as John to everyone around him, relocated with his wife to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He settled comfortably into South Philadelphia, the beating heart of the city's Italian-American community, where the streets rang with familiar dialects, and the comforting smell of Sunday gravy simmering on stovetops reminded him powerfully of home. He found steady work in the construction industry, making full use of his skills as a bricklayer. He opened legitimate businesses along the way, first a restaurant, and later a food distribution warehouse. To any outside observer, John Stanfa was living what looked exactly like the classic American dream. A hard-working immigrant steadily building a better life for himself and his growing family. But beneath that ordinary surface, something else entirely was happening. He was being quietly groomed for a very different kind of role. He was being prepared for initiation into the Philadelphia mob. learning how the various criminal operations worked, steadily proving his reliability and his worth. And in Angelo Bruno, he found a boss unlike any he might have encountered back in Sicily. A man who firmly believed that the best criminal activity was the kind that nobody ever noticed or talked about. A man who valued patient diplomacy far above unnecessary bloodshed. A man who had turned the Philadelphia crime family into one of the most stable, disciplined, and profitable criminal organizations anywhere in the entire country. To fully understand John Stanfa's eventual role within the Philadelphia mob, one must first take the time to understand the man he served so closely for many years. Angelo Bruno, known and respected throughout the entire criminal underworld as the Gentle Don, was born Angelo Annaloro in Villalba, Sicily, in the year 1910. Bruno had immigrated to Philadelphia as a young man and had climbed steadily through the ranks of the city's crime family through a carefully balanced combination of sharp intelligence, extraordinary patience, and well-chosen strategic partnerships. When he took over as boss of the family in 1959, he brought with him a guiding philosophy that was both simple and revolutionary. Make money as quietly as possible, stay away from unnecessary violence at all costs, and never do anything that would draw attention from law enforcement or the news media. For 2 full decades, this approach worked brilliantly and produced remarkable results. While other mafia families tore themselves to pieces with internal power struggles and invited the fury of federal prosecutors, the Philadelphia family, under Bruno's steady guidance, operated with the smooth efficiency of a well-built machine. Bruno kept firm control over gambling operations, loan sharking, and various labor rackets throughout Philadelphia and southern New Jersey. He had judges on his payroll, union leaders firmly in his pocket, and politicians throughout the region who owed him significant personal favors. His strong relationship with the New York families, particularly with Carlo Gambino's powerful organization, gave him both additional clout and reliable protection. When disputes broke out, as they always did eventually in the underworld, Bruno consistently preferred to sit down and negotiate rather than resort to violence and bloodshed. He held a seat on the commission, the high-level governing body of the American mafia as a whole, and he used that position skillfully to mediate conflicts and build the kinds of strong alliances that kept his organization safe and profitable. Bruno's public image was carefully maintained as that of a simple and modest businessman. He lived in an ordinary row house at 934 Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia, drove an unremarkable car, and kept the lowest possible profile in everything he did. He owned legitimate businesses, including an extermination company and various real estate interests. Very few people outside of the criminal underworld even knew his name. And that was precisely and intentionally how he preferred things. Into this carefully constructed and tightly controlled world came John Stanfa, personally recommended by Carlo Gambino himself. Stanfa was gradually handed more and more responsibility within Bruno's organization. By the late 1960s, after he had demonstrated his loyalty and his genuine capability beyond any doubt, Stanfa was formally initiated into the Philadelphia crime family. He became a made man, taking the sacred and binding vows that would tie him to that organization for the rest of his natural life. Even more significantly than that, he became Angelo Bruno's personal driver, a position that carried an immense amount of trust and responsibility. In the mafia, a boss's driver is never just a simple chauffeur. He is a trusted confidant, a personal bodyguard, and often a direct witness to the family's most sensitive and important business dealings. A driver hears the kinds of conversations that could put men in prison for life without any possibility of parole. He knows every place the boss visits every person the boss meets with, every important deal that is being negotiated and finalized. A boss only ever entrusts such extraordinary access to his most dependable and thoroughly tested men. For John Stanfa, this position represented both a tremendous honor and an equally heavy burden. He had accomplished something that countless immigrants could only dream about, earning a position of genuine trust within a powerful and wealthy organization, real financial security for his family, and the deep street respect that came naturally with being so close to the most powerful man in Philadelphia's underworld. His legitimate businesses provided him with a convincing cover story and brought in additional steady income. His family was growing and thriving. Life, by any reasonable measure, was very good indeed. But underneath the calm surface of Bruno's remarkably peaceful reign, dangerous pressures were slowly but surely building up. The year was 1976, and Atlantic City, a struggling and neglected seaside resort town just across the border in New Jersey, legalized casino gambling. The effect was immediate and transformative, almost overnight. The city was completely reinvented as an enormous gold mine. Casino construction projects poured billions of dollars into the local economy, created thousands of new jobs, and opened up previously unimaginable opportunities for corruption and criminal profit. The Philadelphia family had long exercised control over Atlantic City's various rackets and criminal enterprises. But Bruno, who was always cautious and careful in his approach to everything, was reluctant to exploit the casino construction boom too aggressively or too visibly. He allowed the New York families to operate in Atlantic City in exchange for their continued backing of his position as boss. This pragmatic and politically sensible approach made good strategic sense, but it deeply frustrated some of Bruno's own men, who could see that enormous amounts of money were being left sitting on the table unclaimed. Even more troubling than the Atlantic City situation was the growing issue of narcotics. Throughout the 1970s, drug trafficking, particularly heroin, was becoming more and more profitable for criminal organizations everywhere. Other mafia families were generating tremendous fortunes from the drug trade, but Angelo Bruno publicly declared himself firmly opposed to narcotics trafficking and insisted that it was completely off limits for his family. He called it junk and dismissed it as a dirty and reckless business that would only attract overwhelming attention from law enforcement. However, like many mob bosses of his generation, Bruno's public position was actually masking a far more complicated reality. While he officially forbade most of his soldiers from dealing in drugs, he quietly allowed certain trusted and select associates, particularly those with connections to the Gambino family Sicilian wing, including the network that would later become infamous as the Pizza Connection, to operate their own drug distribution networks. This obvious double standard created deep and lasting resentment among men who watched enormous profits flowing to a privileged few, while they themselves were strictly prohibited from participating. The most seriously discontented man of all was Antonio Tony Bananas Caponegro, who served as Bruno's consigliere. Caponegro was heavily involved in drug trafficking, largely without Bruno's full knowledge or awareness. And he strongly believed that the boss's overly cautious approach to running the family was severely limiting their earning potential. He also had close and important ties to the Genovese crime family in New York, particularly to Frank Fonzie Thierry, who served as the Genovese street boss. Throughout 1979 and well into the early months of 1980, Caponegro was actively plotting and scheming. He reached out to Thierry and other contacts he had cultivated in New York, seeking their approval to remove Bruno from power and install himself as the new boss of the Philadelphia family. Thierry, Sensing a golden opportunity to extend Genovese's influence deep into Philadelphia, gave what Caponegro believed was tacit approval from the commission itself. It was a fatal and catastrophic misunderstanding. The commission had never actually approved the murder of Bruno. Thierry had deliberately misled Caponegro and was setting him up for a deadly fall. The evening of March 21st, 1980, began in a completely ordinary and unremarkable way. Angelo Bruno, then 69 years old, went out for dinner at Cos Little Italy, his favorite restaurant in South Philadelphia. He sat down, enjoyed a relaxed and pleasant meal, made conversation with friends, and took care of some routine business matters. It was a Friday night, and the city was alive with the energy and excitement that always comes at the start of a weekend. John Stanfa picked his boss up from the restaurant after dinner had finished. The two men climbed into Stanfa's car, with Bruno settling comfortably into the front passenger seat. Stanfa guided the vehicle through the familiar and well-known streets of South Philadelphia, heading steadily in the direction of Bruno's home on Snyder Avenue. The night air was clear and cool, the streets quiet and peaceful as they drew closer to the mob boss's modest row house. Stanfa pulled up smoothly to the curb in front of 934 Snyder Avenue at around 10 o'clock in the evening. The house was completely dark except for a single light burning inside. Bruno's wife was waiting for him in there. This was a completely routine and ordinary situation. Bruno returning home after an evening of taking care of business. Stanfa dropping him safely at his front door and then going on his way. What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and argued over for many years to come. According to the official version of events, Bruno sat in the passenger seat, quietly smoking a cigarette, and the window next to him was rolled down. Either because Bruno wanted to enjoy his smoke in the cool night air, or as some would later speculate with deep suspicion, because Stanfa had rolled it down for some unstated reason of his own. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, moving quickly and silently toward the parked car. In his hands was a 12-gauge shotgun. He approached from behind, coming up alongside Bruno's open window. The mob boss, completely relaxed and completely at ease in his own familiar neighborhood, never had the slightest idea what was coming. The shotgun blast was absolutely deafening in the quiet residential street. The shot, fired at point-blank range directly through the open window, struck Bruno in the back of his head and killed him instantly. The tremendous force of that single blast shattered the passenger window completely and sprayed blood and brain matter throughout the entire interior of the car. Angelo Bruno, the gentle don who had ruled Philadelphia's underworld with a steady and measured hand for 21 years without causing any major violence, was dead. John Stanfa, sitting only a few feet away, was completely covered with his boss's blood, but was himself physically unharmed. According to the account he would later give to investigators, he immediately ducked down as low as he could inside the car and then fled the scene on foot, running down Snyder Avenue in a state of panic and total shock. Within just a few minutes, Bruno's wife came outside and discovered the body. Police and ambulances arrived quickly to find a scene that would become one of the most iconic and enduring images in all of American mafia history. The elderly mob boss slumped in the passenger seat of his car, the devastating wound to the back of his head clearly visible in the crime scene. Photographs that would later appear on the front pages of newspapers across the entire country. The murder of Angelo Bruno sent powerful shock waves rolling through both Philadelphia and the broader American mafia. The gentle don had been deeply respected across all 5 of the New York families. His death meant the end of 2 decades of relative peace and stability in Philadelphia. It meant that war was most certainly coming. Immediate suspicion and serious attention turned directly toward John Stanfa. How had Bruno's own driver escaped the attack completely uninjured? Why had the passenger window been open on what was described as a cool March evening? Had Stanfa actually played some role in making his boss's murder possible? The theories varied considerably. Some law enforcement officials were firmly convinced that Stanfa had deliberately rolled down the window in order to give the shooter a clear and unobstructed shot. Others believed that he might simply have been in the wrong place at the wrong time by pure chance, spared only because the killers had no interest in anyone except Bruno himself. Still others pointed out that Stanfa's deep connections to the Gambino family in New York might have served as a kind of invisible protection shield around him. Unlike the other conspirators who had been involved in arranging Bruno's murder and who would soon be hunted down and killed in brutal retaliation, Stanfa was spared any immediate violent response. His Sicilian connections and his long-standing relationship with the Gambino family may well have marked him as someone who was untouchable. The full truth of what happened that night on Snyder Avenue remains murky and uncertain to this very day. What is firmly established is that Antonio Caponigro was quickly identified as the mastermind who had ordered and arranged the killing, along with his brother-in-law Alfred Salerno and several other co-conspirators including Frank Sinden and John Simone. Caponigro had organized Bruno's assassination while genuinely believing he had the Commission's blessing and approval. In April 1980, Caponigro was summoned to New York, supposedly to be formally confirmed as the new boss of the Philadelphia family. Instead of that confirmation, he walked directly into a carefully prepared trap. His naked and badly beaten body was found stuffed into the trunk of a car in the Bronx. He had been subjected to prolonged torture before being killed, and in a final act of deeply symbolic humiliation, $300 in cash had been crammed into his mouth and into other parts of his body, a message about his unforgivable greed and his ultimate betrayal of the Commission. One by one, the men who had been part of the conspiracy against Bruno met similar violent ends. They had violated the most fundamental and sacred rule of the entire mafia. You never kill a boss without the explicit approval of the Commission. The consequences were delivered swiftly and without a trace of mercy. John Stanfa, in the meantime, was called before a federal grand jury. Federal prosecutors wanted straight answers about exactly what he had seen that night, what he actually knew, and who was ultimately responsible for the killing. Stanfa did precisely what any proper mafioso would do in that situation. He said as little as humanly possible. He testified that he had seen nothing of any consequence, knew nothing of any relevance, and had simply been doing his job as Bruno's driver. Prosecutors were not at all satisfied with that. They were firmly convinced that Stanfa was lying through his teeth, that he possessed far more knowledge about the murder than he was willing to share with anyone. In December 1980, he was arrested in Baltimore, where he had run to and was working in a pizza shop bakery, trying to stay out of sight. He was charged with perjury for lying to the grand jury about meetings with other mob figures that had taken place in the period following Bruno's death. In 1981, John Stanfa was convicted on the perjury charges and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. It was a substantial sentence, one that effectively removed him from Philadelphia during what would turn out to be one of the most turbulent and bloody periods the city's criminal underworld had ever seen. While John Stanfa sat inside a federal prison, serving out his perjury sentence, the Philadelphia underworld descended into something that looked and felt like an absolute nightmare. Nicodemo Scarfo's rise to the position of boss in 1981 marked the opening of what would come to be remembered as the Second Philadelphia Mob War. a period of extraordinary and relentless violence that would claim more than 30 lives and ultimately leave the crime family in complete ruins. Scarfo was, in almost every meaningful way, the direct opposite of Angelo Bruno, where Bruno was tall and carried himself with quiet authority. Scarfo stood barely 5 feet 5 inches, where Bruno spoke softly and handled conflicts through careful diplomacy. Scarfo was loud, quick to anger, and easily set off, where Bruno avoided the public spotlight with great care and effort. Scarfo seemed almost to actively court attention and publicity, and where Bruno viewed murder as an absolute last resort, to be used only when nothing else would work. Scarfo treated it casually as just another tool of business management. Born in Brooklyn in 1929, Scarfo had moved to South Philadelphia as a young child and had worked his way up steadily through the mob's internal ranks. As a young man, he had tried his hand at boxing as a career path, but when that didn't work out, he threw himself completely into a life of crime. His early reputation was built almost entirely on acts of violence. In 1963, he stabbed a longshoreman to death in the course of a personal argument, earning himself a manslaughter conviction and a 6-month prison sentence. Bruno had actually banished Scarfo to Atlantic City in the 1960s as a punishment after he committed a murder that genuinely angered the boss. At that point in time, Atlantic City was widely considered a backwater, a quiet and unimportant place that represented a kind of professional exile, far away from all the real action in Philadelphia. But Scarfo made the absolute best of his time there, quietly building relationships and patiently waiting for his moment to arrive. When casino gambling was legalized in Atlantic City in 1976, Scarfo suddenly and unexpectedly found himself sitting right on top of a gold mine of opportunity. He moved quickly to position himself to benefit from the enormous construction boom that followed. Using his concrete company and his extensive control over local construction unions, by the time Bruno was shot and killed in 1980, Scarfo had accumulated both considerable personal wealth and a wide network of valuable connections throughout the region. After the murder of Philip Testa in 1981, Scarfo skillfully maneuvered himself into the boss's chair with the official backing of the commission. He named Salvatore Chucky Merlino, father of future boss Joey Merlino, as his underboss, and his nephew Philip Lanetti as his consigliere. What followed was a reign that was defined at every turn by paranoia, relentless greed, and what can only be described as an addiction to violence and bloodshed. Scarfo demanded total and absolute loyalty from every single person around him, along with immediate and unquestioning obedience to his every order. He expected his soldiers to hand over substantial portions of everything they earned as tribute payments to him. Any word or action that could be interpreted as showing disrespect, no matter how minor or seemingly insignificant it might be, could result in a death sentence being issued on the spot. The sheer level of violence that Scarfo unleashed was shocking and deeply disturbing. Even by the already brutal standards of the Mafia, in December of 1980, just a few short months after Bruno's assassination, Philadelphia Roofers Union president John McCullough was shot and killed in his own kitchen by a gunman who had cleverly disguised himself by carrying a poinsettia plant as cover. The killing was ordered because McCullough had refused to hand over control of a bartenders' union in Atlantic City to Scarfo. This cold-blooded murder demonstrated with perfect clarity just how ruthless and uncompromising the new boss intended to be, and how completely willing he was to eliminate anyone at all who happened to stand in his way. The Ricabene War, which broke out in 1982, provided yet another clear illustration of exactly how Scarfo approached the management of his criminal organization. Harry Riccobene, a longtime Philadelphia mobster, who was both widely respected and quietly feared throughout the underworld, flatly refused to pay the regular tribute that Scarfo was demanding from him. Angelo Bruno had never once expected Riccobene to hand over regular kickback payments, correctly recognizing that Riccobene had built up his own independent rackets and his own solid power base over many years. But Scarfo saw things in an entirely different way, as far as he was concerned. Every single mobster operating anywhere within the Philadelphia family's territory owed him money. Period. When Riccobene refused that demand, Scarfo declared open war against him over the next 2 years. The streets of South Philadelphia turned into an active battlefield. Scarfo's forces killed 3 of Riccobene's close associates. The Riccobene faction managed to kill Scarfo's consigliere Frank Monte in retaliation. Riccobene himself survived no fewer than 2 separate assassination attempts against his life. The Riccobene War eventually wound down when Harry Riccobene was arrested and convicted on racketeering charges in 1984. But the damage done to the family's internal stability and sense of unity was permanent and far-reaching. Men who had previously worked side by side in the same organization now regarded each other with deep and constant suspicion. Trust, the essential currency that keeps any mafia family functioning properly, had become genuinely scarce. Perhaps no single episode from this period better captures the essence of Scarfo's paranoia and his willingness to act on it through murder than his treatment of Salvatore Testa, the son of the previously murdered boss Philip Chicken Man Testa. Young Salvatore had been one of Scarfo's most effective and feared killers during the early years of his reign. He had personally avenged his father's brutal murder by hunting down and killing several of the men who had planted the bomb beneath Philip Testa's front porch. But by 1984, Scarfo had begun to see young Testa as a serious and growing threat to his own position. Salvatore was genuinely popular with the younger generation of family members. He was ambitious and driven. He was the son of a former boss, which gave him a natural and undeniable legitimacy in the eyes of many people. In the paranoid calculations that governed Scarfo's thinking, all of these qualities combined to make Salvatore Testa far too dangerous to be allowed to live. In September of 1984, Salvatore Testa was lured to a meeting under the false pretense of discussing routine business matters. When he arrived at the meeting location, a small team of gunmen was waiting for him. He was shot multiple times at close range by men he had considered his closest friends and most loyal colleagues, all of them acting directly on Scarfo's personal orders. His body was found a few days later, left in an empty lot. The murder of Salvatore Testa sent a powerful and deeply unsettling chill through the broader American mafia. Other crime families started viewing Scarfo with a mixture of distrust and genuine alarm. If he was capable of ordering the murder of the son of his own mentor, the very man who had personally avenged his father's death and had proven his absolute loyalty time and time again through years of service, then truly no one anywhere was safe from Scarfo's suspicions. The essential bonds of loyalty and mutual respect that held mafia families together as functioning organizations were being systematically and deliberately torn apart by one man's paranoia. Despite the violence, or perhaps in some twisted way because of it, Scarfo's organization generated enormous profits throughout the 1980s. His iron grip over Atlantic City's entire construction industry, exercised through Scarf Inc. and a web of corrupt union relationships, allowed him to extract tribute payments from virtually every casino project that was being built. He had a financial stake in the concrete that was poured for foundations, a cut of the labor costs on every major project, and meaningful influence over everything from security service contracts to entertainment booking deals. The casinos themselves offered endless opportunities for money laundering schemes. Loan sharking operations targeting gamblers with heavy debts, and a variety of elaborate scams. Union pension funds could be quietly manipulated. The possibilities seemed almost endless. Scarfo's organization also continued to profit handsomely from more traditional criminal operations, including bookmaking, loan sharking, drug trafficking, and systematic extortion of legitimate businesses. Despite Angelo Bruno's earlier and loudly stated prohibition against dealing in narcotics, Scarfo embraced the drug trade as one of his organization's most important profit centers, with his soldiers distributing cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine throughout Philadelphia and all of southern New Jersey. For a time, it genuinely appeared that Scarfo had found a working formula for running a successful criminal empire. Yes, he was excessively violent, but the money kept flowing in. Yes, his men were terrified of him, but that terror kept them in line and obedient. Yes, law enforcement was watching everything he did, but the mob had always survived law enforcement attention before. But Scarfo was making one single fatal and irreversible mistake. He was constructing an entire organization built on a foundation of nothing but fear rather than genuine respect, on personal loyalty to him as an individual, rather than on loyalty to the broader institution of La Cosa Nostra itself. And fear, as he would eventually and painfully discover, is a profoundly fragile foundation. When enough pressure is applied to something built purely on fear, it does not bend, it shatters completely. By the middle of the 1980s, federal prosecutors had assembled extensive RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, cases against Scarfo and his entire organization. The FBI had successfully placed informants throughout the family. Court-authorized wiretaps were picking up damaging and incriminating conversations on a regular basis. Surveillance photographs were documenting meetings and money exchanges. Even more devastating for the organization, men within Scarfo's inner circle began choosing to cooperate with federal authorities. The first major defection came from Nicholas "Nicky" Crow Caramandi, a feared, inexperienced hitman who made the decision to testify against the organization after Scarfo issued an order to have him killed in 1986. Caramandi had been deeply involved in Scarfo's failed attempt to extort $1 million from real estate developer Willard Rose III. When Rouse chose to go directly to the FBI rather than pay the demanded money, the federal agents set up a carefully designed undercover sting operation in response. Caramandi, realizing with absolute certainty that he was going down one way or another, and knowing with equal certainty that Scarfo personally blamed him for the entire debacle, decided to make a deal with prosecutors. His testimony was absolutely devastating to the organization. He described in vivid detail the murder plots that had been hatched and carried out, the extortion schemes that had been run against legitimate businesses, and the complete inner workings of the organization. Other cooperating witnesses followed in Caramandi's footsteps: Thomas Del Giorno, Tony Hips Casella, and most damaging of all, Philip Linetti himself. Linetti's decision to cooperate with the government in 1989, rather than accept a 45-year prison sentence, essentially brought Scarfo's entire reign to its final end. As Scarfo's underboss and his own nephew, Linetti had been present for and party to virtually every significant decision the organization had ever made. He had personally participated in 10 murders. He knew exactly where every single body was buried, both literally and figuratively. In November of 1988, Scarfo and 16 co-defendants were convicted on racketeering charges. including specific charges that their criminal enterprise had been responsible for killing 9 people, attempting to kill 4 others, and engaging in systematic extortion, loan sharking, drug trafficking, and illegal gambling operations. Scarfo received a sentence of 55 years in federal prison and would die behind those bars in 2017, never having set foot in the free world again. With Scarfo convicted and his most important lieutenants either dead, locked away in prison, or actively cooperating with the government, the Philadelphia crime family was left in absolute shambles. The organization that Angelo Bruno had carefully and patiently built into one of the most stable and profitable mafia families in all of America had been completely and utterly destroyed in less than a single decade. The pressing question now was whether it could ever possibly be rebuilt and restored to anything resembling its former self. John Stanfa walked out of federal prison in the late 1980s into a Philadelphia mob scene that was almost completely unrecognizable compared to the one he had left behind when he went in. The roster of made men had been devastated by violence and prosecutions. Many of the old-timers he had known personally were either dead or sitting in prison. The younger generation had grown up entirely under Scarfo's reign of terror and paranoia, absorbing lessons about the criminal life that were very different from what Angelo Bruno had once taught and practiced. Stanfa settled back into his legitimate business interests. His construction company and his food distribution warehouse on Oregon Avenue in South Philadelphia. He kept himself quiet and out of sight, carefully avoiding drawing any unnecessary attention from law enforcement, and slowly began reconnecting with old contacts who were still out on the street. He also maintained and carefully cultivated his connections to the Gambino family back in New York, relationships that would turn out to be absolutely crucial in the years that lay ahead. He watched and waited patiently as various potential candidates jostled for position, trying to succeed Scarfo. Some observers in the know believed that John Stanfa himself might be a genuine candidate for the top position. After all, he had been personally close to Angelo Bruno. He had paid his dues by doing time in a federal prison, and he had exactly the right kind of pedigree and the right kind of powerful connections. But Stanfa was cautious and careful by nature. The FBI was watching everyone who had any association with mob activity. Moving too quickly or too visibly could bring exactly the kind of attention he wanted to avoid. Moreover, there was the deeply troubling question of whether the Philadelphia family could even be salvaged at this point. The younger members who remained active on the streets had been shaped and hardened by Scarfo's violent methods and his culture of fear. They lacked the discipline and the deep respect for tradition that Stanfa valued and considered essential to any properly run organization. Many of them were drug users or reckless cowboys who cared far more about making fast money than about observing any code of honor. Stanfa bided his time carefully, running his legitimate businesses and making quiet and careful assessments of everyone around him. He observed the young men who were making noise on the streets, men like Joseph Skinny Joey Merlino, the son of Salvatore Merlino, who had been Scarfo's underboss and was now locked away in prison. Joey Merlino was flashy and charismatic and openly loved nightlife and the attention it brought him. He was everything that Stanfa personally despised about the new American-born generation of criminals. Loud and completely undisciplined, far more interested in being famous and recognized than in being smart and careful. But Stanfa was also sharp enough to recognize the genuine opportunity that existed right in front of him. The family was weak and leaderless, adrift without any clear direction. The commission in New York was actively looking for someone capable of restoring order to Philadelphia and getting the family functioning again. And John Stanfa, with his deep Sicilian roots, his established connections to the Gambino family, and his years of direct experience working under Angelo Bruno himself might be exactly the right man for that job. He simply needed to wait for precisely the right moment. And in the Mafia, as he had learned thoroughly back in Sicily, patience was very often richly rewarded. By 1991, the Philadelphia crime family was experiencing a full-blown crisis. Nicky Scarfo was locked away in prison for life, with no realistic possibility of ever getting out. His designated successor, Anthony "Tony Buck" Piccolo, had also been convicted and imprisoned. The acting boss, Joseph "Joey" Chung Coglini SR, was elderly and simply did not possess the physical or mental strength needed to exercise meaningful control over the younger and more aggressive elements of the family. The organization was essentially rudderless, drifting without direction, and the New York Commission was growing visibly and increasingly impatient with the situation. The Commission, made up of the bosses of New York's 5 families, had a significant and direct financial interest in seeing Philadelphia stabilized. The family controlled important criminal rackets throughout Philadelphia, southern New Jersey, and Delaware, territories that were valuable and strategically important to the broader American Mafia. An unstable and leaderless Philadelphia family meant lost revenues, potential friction and conflicts with neighboring families, and a flood of unwanted law enforcement attention directed at the entire region. Even more concerning than all of that was the very real possibility that the young American-born faction of the family might attempt to simply seize power for themselves without ever seeking or receiving proper commission approval. Men like Joey Merlino, Michael Chong Coglini Jr., the son of acting boss Joey Chong, and their close associates represented a new generation of criminals who did not always honor or even acknowledge the old traditions and protocols. They were flashy, frequently reckless in their behavior, and becoming steadily more independent in their thinking and their actions. The Commission needed to find someone who would genuinely respect their authority and work to restore the traditional order that had served everyone well under Angelo Bruno's long and profitable reign. John Stanfa's name kept surfacing repeatedly in those discussions. He had all the right credentials on paper, born in Sicily, a former personal driver for Angelo Bruno himself, solid family connections to the Gambino family through his relatives, and a widely acknowledged reputation for seriousness and personal discipline. He had not been mixed up in Scarfo's chaos and violence because he had been safely locked away in a federal prison during those years. He represented a fresh and clean start, a genuine opportunity to return to the kind of stability and profitability that had characterized the Bruno-era John Gotti, the loud and flamboyant boss of the Gambino family who had himself grabbed power through brazen murder in 1985 and who was by 1992 headed straight toward his own conviction and life sentence, gave his personal blessing to the choice. The other commission members agreed with the selection. In the early months of 1991, the decision was officially made and finalized. John Stanfa would take over as the new boss of the Philadelphia crime family. For Stanfa, now 50 years old, it represented the culmination of decades of patient work and careful positioning within organized crime. He would finally be given the chance to lead in the way he had always believed was right, to put his vision of how a mafia family should truly be run into actual practice. He would bring back the discipline and the deep respect for authority that had characterized Bruno's reign. He would carry old-world Sicilian values back to the streets of Philadelphia. It was a remarkable opportunity, but it was also, though he could not yet see it clearly, a poisoned chalice waiting to destroy him. John Stanfa stepped into his new role as boss with a very specific guiding philosophy, rooted firmly in his Sicilian upbringing and everything he had absorbed from a lifetime in that culture. He believed absolutely in clear hierarchy, in respect for authority at every level, in the absolute importance of tradition and iron discipline. He dressed conservatively and carefully. He spoke in a quiet and measured voice. He carried himself at all times with the kind of quiet dignity he believed a boss was obligated to project. He immediately set about establishing a structured organization, naming Frank Martins as his underboss and Joseph Skinny Joey Ciancaglini SR as his consigliere. He personally reached out to the remaining maid members and various associates throughout the region, firmly asserting his new authority and laying out his expectations with complete clarity. There would be order and discipline from this point forward, and there would be proper respect shown to the boss at all times. Stanfa also made a decision that would turn out to be one of the most important and faithful of his entire tenure. He deliberately chose to surround himself primarily with men who had been born and raised in the old country. He actively imported Sicilians, men he felt he could trust completely, men who had grown up understanding and living by the traditional ways. The most important of these imports was Sergio Battaglia, a feared and experienced enforcer who quickly became Stanfa's primary source of muscle and violence. There was also Rosario Bellocchi and various other Sicilians who formed a tight and exclusive inner circle around the new boss. This decision made a certain kind of strategic sense from Stanfa's perspective. These men had no pre-existing loyalty to any American-born faction within the family. They owed everything to Stanfa personally and would not question his authority or scheme behind his back. They understood Omerta at the deepest level and genuinely respected the traditional mafia hierarchy he was trying to establish. But this same decision also created an immediate and deeply serious tension with the American-born members of the family, particularly the younger generation who had grown up in Philadelphia and thought of themselves as the rightful future of the organization. To the young American-born members, Stanfa's imported Sicilian crew looked and felt exactly like an invasion by outsiders. Men who had never earned their positions within the Philadelphia family through years of street-level work, who spoke with thick accents that marked them as foreign, and who seemed to look down their noses at American-born Italians as somehow inferior or less legitimate. Joey Merlino and his crew, which included Michael Ciancaglini Jr., George Borghese, Eaton Lucibello, and several others, were particularly and openly resentful of the whole situation. These were men in their late 20s and early 30s, third-generation Italian-Americans who had come of age during Scarfo's brutal reign and who had learned the criminal life from the ground up on the actual streets of South Philadelphia. They were genuine earners bringing real money into the organization from drug-dealing operations, bookmaking, and a wide variety of street-level criminal activities. They firmly believed that they deserved respect and advancement within the family structure. Instead, they found themselves being systematically pushed aside and marginalized by a boss who clearly did not trust them, who kept handing out key positions to Sicilian imports who had never proved themselves on Philadelphia's streets, and who treated them less like valued and productive soldiers who deserved to be rewarded and more like unruly and troublesome children who needed to be watched and controlled. The cultural clash between the two sides was fundamental and ran very deep. Stanfa prized silence, careful discretion, and strict adherence to traditional protocols and procedures. The Young Turks were loud and visible. They went to nightclubs and threw their money around. They attracted attention to themselves almost constantly, and they believed that making good money was what really and ultimately mattered most. Stanfa saw them as undisciplined and dangerous cowboys who would eventually bring the entire organization crashing down through their recklessness. They looked at him as an out-of-touch old man from another era who was trying to import outdated and irrelevant Sicilian customs to a modern American city where they simply didn't fit anymore. Despite these growing and serious tensions, Stanfa's first year as boss of the family showed some genuine promise. He successfully re-established important working relationships with the other families in the commission, showing proper respect to the New York bosses who had chosen and installed him. He set about rebuilding the family's various criminal enterprises and rackets, most of which had deteriorated badly during the chaos of the Scarfo years and the massive wave of federal prosecutions that had followed. He directed his attention and resources toward the most reliable traditional moneymakers, including illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, labor racketeering schemes, and various construction industry frauds. His food distribution business on Oregon Avenue continued to provide both legitimate income and a useful front for certain criminal activities. Stanfa also made a serious and consistent effort to impose genuine discipline on the family's day-to-day operations. He expected his soldiers and associates to attend regular meetings, to keep accurate accounting of their earnings, and to reliably send a percentage of everything they made upward to him as boss. This was perfectly standard mafia practice and had been the way things worked under Angelo Bruno. The boss receives regular tribute payments from his soldiers, which funds the overall operation and enriches those in leadership. But Stanfa's very specific expectations ran almost immediately into problems with the younger faction. Joey Merlino and his closely knit crew were pulling in significant money from their drug distribution operations and various other street activities, but they were deeply and stubbornly reluctant to share much of it with a boss they had never chosen and did not respect. Their position was that they were the ones out there taking all the real risks every day, doing the actual work and generating the actual income. Why should they be expected to hand over large percentages of their earnings to someone they viewed as a fake and illegitimate boss? Stanfa's response to their resistance was to apply even more aggressive pressure. He demanded detailed reports of what they were earning, insisted on even larger tribute payments than before, and made it unmistakably clear that continued disobedience of any kind would simply not be tolerated under his leadership. This approach only served to deepen and harden the resentment that was already building. The situation was made significantly more complicated by the fact that Michael Chong Coglany Jr.'s father, Joey Chong Sar, was serving as Stanfa's own consigliere. The elder Chong Coglany found himself caught in an increasingly painful and impossible position. His formal role required his absolute loyalty to the boss, but his own flesh and blood was leading the faction that was moving steadily and openly toward confrontation with that same boss. He tried his best to mediate and find some workable middle ground between the two sides, but he was trapped between his duty and his family ties. By the end of 1991, the tensions had climbed well past the point of easy management. Stanfa was hearing persistent rumors that the Young Turks were openly mocking him behind his back, calling him the Zip, a deeply offensive and derogatory slang term for freshly arrived Sicilian immigrants, and openly questioning his right to lead the Philadelphia family in private meetings with each other. He sensed the hostilities simmering just below the surface of any interaction he had with them, held in check only by the thinnest possible layer of forced politeness and fake respect. Stanfa's paranoia began to grow and spread like a deep infection. He had been watching from prison as Scarfo's organization tore itself apart through endless internal plotting and betrayal. He understood from his own experience that in the mafia, Showing any sign of weakness was potentially fatal. He made a firm internal decision that he needed to send an absolutely unmistakable message to the discontented faction. A demonstration that challenges to his authority would be met with overwhelming and decisive violence. He simply needed to wait for the right opening to present itself. And in the early weeks of 1992, precisely that opportunity appeared. On the morning of March 2nd, 1992, Michael Chung Coglini Jr., known in the neighborhood simply as Mikey Chung, was going about his usual business on the streets of South Philadelphia. The 31-year-old was widely considered a rising star within the Young Turks faction. He was the son of a made man, a close and trusted associate of Joey Molino, well-liked by nearly everyone who knew him, handsome, and fiercely ambitious about his future within the organization. He was also becoming increasingly vocal and direct in his criticism of John Stanfa, whenever he believed he was speaking in safe company. What Chung Coglini had no way of knowing was that Stanfa had already reached his decision about him. The combination of his family background and connections, his father's position as the consigliere, his natural popularity with the younger members, and his active and open opposition to Stanfa's leadership had made him, in Stanfa's cold calculation, too serious a threat to be left alive. Stanfa reached out to his Sicilian enforcer Sergio Battaglia and arranged for the hit to be carried out. The plan itself was simple and straightforward. Find Chung Coglini alone and eliminate him. The message it would send to the rest of the Young Turks would be unmistakable and permanent. On March 2nd, Chung Coglini was lured to a specific location under the cover of some routine and legitimate-sounding business matter. When he arrived, Battaglia and a second gunman were positioned and waiting for him. Multiple shots were fired at extremely close range. But something went seriously and catastrophically wrong with the operation, despite being struck by multiple bullets, including a round to the head. Michael Chung Coglini did not die. He was critically and horrifically wounded and was rushed immediately to the hospital, where surgeons worked through the night to keep him alive. Against every conceivable expectation, he survived, though he was left with severe and permanent brain damage that effectively ended his active participation in any aspect of criminal life. The botched hit was a disaster of the first order for Stanfa in almost every way imaginable. He had tried to murder the son of his own consigliere, a breathtaking violation of traditional protocols that demonstrated, simultaneously, both his ruthlessness and his fundamental disregard for the established mafia, relationships that were supposed to govern how things were done. The hit had failed completely, which made him look not just ruthless, but weak and incompetent in front of everyone watching. And the target had survived as a living and breathing reminder, walking evidence of Stanfa's treachery and his failure. Joey Chung Coglini SR, the elderly consigliere, now faced a situation that was genuinely impossible to navigate. His own boss had tried to have his own son killed. His position theoretically demanded unwavering loyalty to Stanfa, but his blood and his heart demanded something entirely different. He ultimately chose to essentially withdraw from any active role in the family's affairs, refusing either to openly defy Stanfa or to give him any meaningful support going forward. For Joey Molino and the Young Turks who remained active and dangerous, the message delivered by the shooting of Michael Chung Coglini was absolutely crystal clear. Stanfa was prepared and willing to kill them. Any remaining pretense of working within his organization as legitimate soldiers was gone and done with. This was no longer a question of respecting someone's authority or paying appropriate tribute to a boss you disagreed with. This had become a matter of pure survival. Either they found a way to eliminate Stanfa before he could get to them, or he would eventually finish what he had started and kill them all. The Philadelphia mob war that would define the next 3 years had officially and irreversibly begun. In the weeks that followed the Ciancaglini shooting, the Philadelphia family split sharply and permanently into 2 armed and hostile camps. On one side stood John Stanfa, his imported Sicilian enforcers, and whatever family members either genuinely supported his leadership or were simply too frightened of him to openly oppose it. On the other side were Joey Merlino, the Young Turks, and a growing number of associates who had arrived at the shared conclusion that John Stanfa had to be removed from power by any means necessary. The lines dividing the 2 sides were not always perfectly clear or fixed. Some men tried very hard to remain neutral, going about their own business as quietly as possible, while doing everything they could to stay out of the escalating conflict. Others made their true allegiance known through their daily actions, through who they were seen spending time with, whose orders they followed, and whose company they refused to keep. Stanfa's faction held certain important advantages. He was the officially recognized and commission-backed boss of the family. He had direct connections to the Gambino family and other powerful New York families. His Sicilian crew members were experienced, well-disciplined, and genuinely ruthless. He had access to weapons and financial resources to fund an extended conflict, but the Young Turks had their own significant advantages to work with. They were younger, possessed far more physical energy and street stamina, and were deeply and completely rooted in the specific neighborhoods and streets of South Philadelphia. They ran their own independent crews and maintained their own criminal income streams. They commanded genuine loyalty and popular support among many of the younger associates and street-level criminals who saw them as the authentic future of the family. And perhaps most importantly of all, the Young Turks had absolutely nothing left to lose. Stanfa had already tried to kill one of their most prominent leaders. They had no illusions about what their future would look like if they tried to make peace or simply accept Stanfa's dominance. Their only real options were to fight hard or to run. And these were men who had been raised and educated in the brutal violence of Scarfo's mob. They knew exactly how to fight. One of the most genuinely tragic elements of the entire unfolding conflict was John Stanfa's conscious and deliberate decision to draw his own son deeper and deeper into the violence. Joseph Stanfa Jr., in his early 20s, had up to that point been kept largely separate from his father's criminal world and activities. He was working in the family's legitimate construction business, trying to build a real life and a real future for himself, well outside the world of organized crime. But as the conflict with the Young Turks escalated and his list of trusted men grew shorter, John Stanfa began to see enemies everywhere he looked and to trust fewer and fewer of the people around him. He needed individuals he could trust with absolute certainty and without any reservation whatsoever. And in his deeply Sicilian worldview, the strongest and most unbreakable bonds that existed in the world were bonds of family blood. He began bringing his son into his world gradually, first as his driver, then as a companion on business trips and meetings, and eventually as an active participant in the organization's criminal activities. This decision, made out of a desperate need for people he could fully trust, would come back to haunt John Stanfa in the most painful and personal way possible. By drawing Joseph Jr. into the mob war, he was placing his son squarely and directly in the line of fire. The Young Turks would make no distinction between a father and a son when it came to settling scores. The relationship between John Stanfa and his son Joseph Jr. stands as one of the genuine tragedies that runs through the entire story of the Philadelphia mob war. John Stanfa had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and built a new life in America with the specific dream of giving his children opportunities and possibilities that he had never had growing up in Sicily. Instead, his relentless pursuit of power and his refusal to let go of it, even when it became genuinely dangerous, would end with his son bleeding heavily in the front seat of a moving car. Shot in the face by men who were roughly the same age as his college classmates, by the middle of 1992, both sides of the conflict were in the final stages of preparing for open and sustained war against each other. Weapons were being stockpiled and acquired, not merely handguns and revolvers, but automatic rifles, shotguns, and even homemade explosive devices. Safe houses were established in various locations. Careful and patient surveillance was conducted on both sides to map out the movements and daily patterns of key targets. Alliances with trusted outside parties were carefully formed and tested. The streets of South Philadelphia, which had experienced relative peace under Angelo Bruno's long reign and had barely managed to recover from the trauma of Scarfo's years of terror, were about to become an active war zone once again. And this time, the violence would be more public, more shocking, and more completely relentless than anything the city had ever witnessed before. The summer of 1992 brought the Philadelphia mob war out of the shadows and into open and active violence. Both factions began making aggressive moves against each other, testing each other's defenses and looking hard for any opportunity to deliver decisive and crippling blows to the opposing side. In August of 1992, John Stanfa himself narrowly survived being killed when gunmen opened fire on his vehicle in South Philadelphia. The armored car he had by then adopted as his standard mode of transportation absorbed the attack and saved his life. But the attempt confirmed what he already knew in his bones. The Young Turks were genuinely coming for him with everything they had. The attack also made it unmistakably clear that they were both serious about their intentions and fully capable of executing a non-operation against him. Stanfa's response was to dramatically increase and tighten his personal security arrangements in every possible way. He began traveling exclusively in armored vehicles at all times. He deliberately varied his routes and his daily schedules to prevent any predictable pattern from forming. He surrounded himself at all times with a layer of bodyguards, particularly relying on his trusted Sicilian crew for close personal protection. He became increasingly and deeply paranoid, seeing potential threats in virtually every person and situation around him. He also struck back aggressively throughout the latter months of 1992 and into 1993. Stanfa's crew attempted numerous hits against members of the Young Turks faction during this period. Some of those attempts were successful, many were not, but each one contributed further to an atmosphere of constant terror and pervasive paranoia on both sides of the conflict. The violence developed its own grim and predictable rhythm over time. Men would be ambushed outside their homes, caught in their cars at traffic stops, attacked at the businesses they frequented. Shootings began occurring in broad daylight, on busy streets in front of horrified civilian witnesses. The families of known mob figures became a kind of collateral damage, never typically targeted directly, but forced to live in a constant state of fear and dread, wondering whether a hit team might appear at any moment. Law enforcement watched everything that was happening with a troubling mixture of genuine horror and careful, investigative interest. The violence was shocking and was generating enormous public pressure on police and federal authorities to do something immediate and decisive. But at the same time, the mob war was also creating valuable intelligence opportunities that the FBI was determined to exploit. Paranoid mobsters on both sides were making costly mistakes. They were saying things over tapped phone lines that they should never have said. They were turning against each other under pressure. Every act of violence was another potential RICO predicate charge that could be added to future indictments. The FBI significantly intensified its already substantial surveillance operations against both factions. Agents followed the key players on both sides constantly, photographed their meetings, and recorded their telephone conversations. They actively developed informants within both camps, men who were either caught committing crimes and chose cooperation as a way out, or who had become so genuinely frightened of being murdered that they decided their best, and perhaps only path to safety, was to trade information for federal protection. One aspect of Stanfa's criminal operation that was of particular concern to law enforcement investigators was his continuing and active connection to Sicilian mafia networks back in the old country. In the early 1990s, the Italian mafia was still dealing with the fallout from the Maxi trials in Sicily that had put hundreds of its members behind bars. But the overall organization remained powerful and genuinely dangerous. Stanfa maintained meaningful relationships with Sicilian clans, both as a source of additional manpower for his ongoing war against the young Turks and as potential partners in future drug trafficking ventures. While he publicly maintained the image of a traditional rackets boss running gambling and loan sharking operations, federal investigators were increasingly confident that he was actively involved in narcotics trafficking, the very same activity that had ultimately contributed to the unraveling of Angelo Bruno's careful and peaceful organization. The recruitment and deployment of Sicilian enforcers like Sergio Battaglia was about more than just having loyal soldiers who would follow his orders without question. It was about bringing into Philadelphia men who had been trained in the particularly brutal and cold-blooded methods of the Sicilian mafia, who had no pre-existing relationships or entanglements with the American-born faction, and therefore had no divided loyalties, and who could be counted on with absolute certainty to carry out any order given to them. But this strategy carried its own serious weaknesses that Stanfa may not have fully appreciated. The Sicilian crew members stood out visibly and uncomfortably in South Philadelphia. Their foreign accents, their distinctly different mannerisms, and their general air of being outsiders made them conspicuous and easy to observe. Federal agents found it relatively straightforward to track and surveil them, precisely because they did not blend naturally into the neighborhood the way American-born locals did, and their very conspicuous presence continued to be a constant source of alienation and resentment among the American-born members of the family who might otherwise have remained neutral in the conflict rather than actively choosing sides against Stanfa. Unlike the Bruno era, when the Philadelphia mob had operated almost entirely out of the public eye and ordinary, citizens had little awareness of what was happening. Stanfa's mob war became a genuine and ongoing media spectacle. Every single shooting made newspaper headlines. Television news crews rushed to crime scenes to film and broadcast the aftermath. Local papers ran in-depth features about the war that was tearing the family apart and published detailed profiles of the key figures on both sides. Joey Merlino, in particular, seemed to genuinely enjoy and welcome the media attention he was receiving. Handsome and naturally charismatic, he was frequently photographed standing outside his social club on Passyunk Avenue, grinning and waving for the cameras without any apparent concern about what the publicity might mean for his legal situation. He dressed stylishly and expensively, frequented trendy restaurants and packed nightclubs around the city, and cultivated a carefully constructed public image of the modern and fashionable gangster who wasn't afraid of anyone or anything. In many significant ways, he was the exact and deliberate opposite of Stanfa's low profile, old-world approach to everything. This relentless media attention created serious consequences for both sides of the conflict. It increased public pressure on law enforcement officials to end the violence as quickly as possible. It made every player on both sides substantially more vulnerable to ongoing surveillance and future prosecution. And it violated one of the most fundamental operating principles of any successful criminal organization, staying entirely out of the public spotlight. But for Merlino and the Young Turks, the publicity seemed worth whatever risks it created. They were actively building a myth around themselves, constructing a public image of brave underdogs standing their ground against a tyrant boss who had been imposed on them against their will by the old men sitting in New York. Whether this was a deliberate and calculated strategy or simply an organic result of their personalities and the way they had grown up, it worked powerfully for them in terms of recruiting new members and earning street credibility throughout South Philadelphia. There were several half-hearted attempts at establishing some kind of peace during this period. Concerned intermediaries from New York, worried about the spiraling violence and the massive amount of law enforcement attention it was generating for everyone connected to organized crime, attempted to arrange meetings between Stanfa and Merlino aimed at working out a workable truce. But the fundamental problem was that neither side was willing to budge on the central issue at stake. Stanfa insisted on being recognized, without question, as the absolute and legitimate boss of the family, and demanded that the Young Turks fall in line, pay proper tribute, and follow his orders without complaint or hesitation. Merlino and his crew would not, under any circumstances, subordinate themselves to a man they considered illegitimate and treacherous. Moreover, blood had already been spilled in significant quantities. Michael Chang Shonkaglini lay permanently damaged in a hospital bed, a living reminder of what Stanfa had done and what he was clearly willing to do again. Men on both sides had been killed and seriously wounded in the exchanges that had followed. In the culture of the mafia, blood debts of this magnitude cannot be easily forgiven or forgotten by anyone involved. Vendettas become matters of personal and family honor that transcend any practical or financial calculation. The failed peace negotiations only reinforced the understanding on both sides that this particular war could only possibly end with one faction standing in complete victory and the other completely and utterly destroyed. There would be no negotiated settlement, no shared power arrangement, no compromise solution of any kind. This was a fight that would go all the way to the finish, which brings the story back to where it began, August 31st, 1993, and the morning that would become the single most infamous and widely remembered day of the entire Philadelphia mob war. John Stanfa was traveling on the Schuylkill Expressway in his armored Cadillac during the height of morning rush hour traffic, accompanied by his son Joseph Jr. and driven by his bodyguard Freddie Aldrich. Despite the extraordinary level of security precautions he had put in place, Stanfa still had to physically move through the city to conduct his business, and the Young Turks had proven themselves to be patient and determined hunters. The hit team had almost certainly been following Stanfa's movements for multiple days beforehand, carefully studying his patterns and looking for the perfect moment and location to strike. The expressway, with its dense bumper-to-bumper traffic and extremely limited options for escape, had presented itself as an ideal ambush site. The shooters pulled their blue Dodge sedan smoothly alongside Stanfa's armored Cadillac and opened fire without any hesitation. Automatic weapons fire erupted in a terrifying burst, rounds slamming into the armored glass of the Cadillac, the deafening sound drawing the horrified attention of commuters all around them who suddenly found themselves witnesses to an attempted mob hit in broad daylight on one of the city's busiest highways. The armored glass held and absorbed most of the rounds. But one bullet either found a small gap in the protection or the glass had been weakened, enough by the sustained barrage that it finally gave way, and the round struck Joseph Stanfa Jr. in the face. The young man cried out in terrible pain as blood filled the interior of the car rapidly. Freddie Aldrich, drawing on every bit of combat training his military years had given him, kept his composure completely. He maneuvered the heavy armored vehicle deliberately toward the guardrail and used it as cover to break the shooter's clear line of fire, then pushed hard on the accelerator and drove directly toward the nearest exit ramp, putting as much distance as quickly as possible between them and the ambush. The blue Dodge gave brief chase and then abruptly broke off, disappearing into the flow of traffic seconds before police sirens began wailing in the distance. Aldrich drove without stopping directly to Mercy Catholic Medical Center. Joseph Jr. was taken immediately into emergency surgery, where doctors worked urgently to stabilize him and repair the devastating damage the bullet had done to his jaw and the surrounding facial structure. He would survive his wounds, but he would require extensive and painful reconstructive surgery over a long period of time, and he would carry both visible physical scars and deep psychological wounds for the rest of his life. John Stanfa, who had somehow come through the ambush without a single physical injury, sat in the hospital waiting area consumed by what must have been a powerful mixture of pure rage, genuine fear, and an overwhelming and crushing sense of personal guilt. His son, his own innocent son, who he himself had pulled into this world, had been shot because of the choices his father had made and the enemies those choices had created. The mob war had found its way home in the most personal and devastating way imaginable. The expressway attack was a turning point that changed everything. It proved several important things simultaneously and beyond any remaining doubt. First, that the Young Turks were fully prepared and willing to attack Stanfa anywhere at all, even on a packed public highway in the middle of morning rush hour with hundreds of civilian witnesses all around them. Second, that they had access to serious military-grade firepower and were completely willing to use every bit of it. Third, that even Stanfa's most elaborate security arrangements were not enough to fully protect him. And fourth, that the war had reached a level of open and reckless violence that was completely out of control and simply could not be allowed to continue. The law enforcement response was immediate and forceful. The spectacle of automatic weapons fire on a major public highway during morning rush hour was something that no government official could possibly tolerate or explain away. Federal agents and Philadelphia police officers both dramatically intensified their investigations into both factions simultaneously. Surveillance operations were expanded. Informants were squeezed hard for fresh and actionable intelligence. Indictments that had been in various stages of preparation were accelerated toward completion. But even as the full weight of the government began pressing down on them from every direction, both sides of the mob war seemed genuinely unable to stop themselves from continuing. The violence had developed its own momentum. Independent of anyone's conscious choice, blood demanded blood in return. Honor required retaliation for every injury and insult. And in the twisted but internally consistent logic of organized crime, the only reliable path to survival was to eliminate your enemies so completely and thoroughly that they could never come after you again. In the aftermath of the expressway attack, John Stanfa's paranoia climbed to heights that interfered seriously with his ability to function as any kind of effective leader. He rarely left the security of his home without a full security detail surrounding him on all sides. When he did go out, it was always in armored vehicles along routes that had been swept and checked in advance. He trusted no one at all outside his small and tight-knit Sicilian inner circle. His relationships with even his closest longtime associates became increasingly strained and difficult as his suspicion of everyone around him grew beyond rational proportions. He was convinced that informants had penetrated his organization from multiple directions. He believed that men who swore loyalty to his face were secretly meeting with the Young Turks or with the FBI behind his back. This paranoia was not entirely without basis, since the FBI had indeed successfully placed informants within his organization, but it made effective leadership and strategic thinking nearly impossible to sustain. Joey Merlino and the Young Turks, meanwhile, were wrestling with their own considerable challenges. The failed hit on the expressway had wounded Stanfa's son, but had left the actual target completely unharmed. The breathtakingly public nature of the attack had multiplied the law, enforcement pressure being applied to everyone on both sides of the conflict. Merlino himself was constantly on the move, never sleeping in the same place twice, always changing his routines and avoiding any predictable patterns that might make him an easy target for Stanfa's hunters. Yet despite all of this, he continued to appear at his favorite spots around South Philadelphia, projecting an air of absolute confidence and total defiance that was either genuine or the most convincing performance possible. Both sides maintained active and carefully updated lists of priority targets on the other side, men who needed to be eliminated to weaken the opposing faction or deliver a message that couldn't be ignored. These lists were continuously revised and updated as new intelligence came in, as personal grudges deepened, and as the strategic calculus of the war shifted. For Stanfa, the highest priority targets were the core leadership of the Young Turks. Merlino himself first and foremost, George Borges, Giton Lucibello, and the others who were directly running the military operations against him. He also placed high priority on eliminating anyone within his own circle who was suspected of passing information to the FBI. In the mob's own internal logic, rats represented a far greater existential threat to the organization than any rival faction. For the Young Turks, the target list started with Stanfa himself as the most urgent priority, but also prominently included his key enforcers, particularly the Sicilian imports like Sergio Battaglia, who were personally responsible for the most serious acts of violence against their faction, and anyone else who was actively and meaningfully supporting Stanfa's continued leadership. The violence during this period settled into a disturbing and repetitive pattern of attack, followed by counterattack. Strike followed by retaliation. A member of one side would be shot, and within days or sometimes only hours, the other faction would respond in kind. Each incident generated fresh newspaper headlines, new police investigations that strained departmental resources, and another funeral procession moving slowly through the streets of South Philadelphia. Some of the attacks were carefully planned and precisely executed operations that demonstrated real tactical sophistication. Others were nothing more than opportunistic strikes, quick actions taken when a recognized target happened to present itself unexpectedly. Some succeeded completely in their objectives, killing or seriously wounding the intended victims. Many others failed for various reasons, whether the target got lucky, civilian bystanders accidentally intervened, or the shooters simply failed to hit what they were aiming at. One of the most deeply disturbing aspects of the entire mob war was the degree to which it endangered completely innocent civilians who had no connection to either faction. The shootings happened in public places, at restaurants and corner stores, on street corners and gas station lots. Wherever ordinary people went about their daily lives. In one incident during this period, stray bullets from a mob-related shooting struck the side of a nearby residential house, causing absolute terror for a family that was sitting down to dinner inside. In another, a violent confrontation between the two factions broke out in the immediate vicinity of a school at almost exactly the moment children were being dismissed for the afternoon. These near misses for innocent civilians generated intense public outrage throughout the city and placed enormous additional pressure on law enforcement officials to shut the entire thing down through whatever means were necessary. Media coverage of the war was constant and relentless. Local newspapers were running frequent and detailed stories about the mob war from every conceivable angle. Television news programs broadcast footage from crime scenes and conducted interviews with shaken neighborhood residents who were frightened and furious about what was happening around them. Both factions were profiled extensively, their histories explained, and their key members identified by name. This wall-to-wall publicity had a profound and lasting effect on how law enforcement ultimately chose to approach and resolve the situation. In Angelo Bruno's era, when organized crime activity was discreet and largely invisible to ordinary citizens and rarely, if ever, directly affected their lives, there had existed a certain amount of unofficial tolerance for the mob's presence in the city. But open and ongoing warfare, fought with automatic weapons and explosives on public streets and highways, with innocent civilians regularly caught in the crossfire, was something entirely different and completely unacceptable. Federal prosecutors began accelerating the preparation of comprehensive RICO cases against both factions. The overall strategic approach was straightforward and clear. If normal policing and reactive law enforcement couldn't stop the violence, then coordinated and massive federal prosecutions, resulting in life sentences for everyone in leadership, would. By the autumn of 1993, the FBI had extensive and highly sophisticated surveillance operations, running simultaneously against both Stanfa and the Young Turks. Wiretaps provided real-time intelligence about planned hits and other criminal activities. Physical surveillance teams tracked the daily movements and meetings of all the major players on both sides. Paid informants embedded within both organizations supplied critical, inside information about leadership structures, ongoing criminal enterprises, and planned acts of violence. One of the FBI's most valuable informants turned out to be John Vesey, a close and trusted associate of Stanfa, who had personally participated in multiple murders carried out on the boss's orders. Vesey was arrested on unrelated charges in 1993 and faced a lengthy prison sentence with no realistic prospect of a favorable outcome at trial. He made the difficult and consequential decision to cooperate fully with federal authorities. His testimony would prove absolutely devastating to Stanfa's organization. He provided first-hand and detailed eyewitness accounts of murders he had personally taken part in, described the complete organizational structure of the operation, and directly implicated Stanfa in ordering specific acts of violence. His willingness to come forward and testify was part of a larger and accelerating pattern. The sustained terror of the mob war had so thoroughly eroded the bonds of trust and loyalty within both organizations that increasing numbers of men were making the calculation that cooperating with the government offered them a better chance of survival than staying silent and hoping for the best. Another highly valuable asset for law enforcement was Ron Previte, a Philadelphia police officer who had become deeply involved with the mob over time. Previte provided law enforcement with uniquely valuable insights into the organization's day-to-day activities and helped set up and facilitate key surveillance operations. His cooperation was a vivid illustration of just how broadly and deeply the mob war had compromised both factions, and how far the infection had spread into unexpected places. Perhaps even more revealing than they all. Successful attacks during this period were the numerous botched and completely failed assassination, attempts that both sides left behind them throughout 1992 and 1993. Both factions appeared to be operating with substantially more ambition and enthusiasm than actual competence, resulting in a long series of embarrassingly mismanaged operations that would almost have been darkly funny if the underlying intent hadn't been so deadly serious. In one particularly notable incident, Stanfa's crew attempted to place a car bomb outside a social club that was regularly used by the Young Turks. The bomb was successfully planted overnight, but it malfunctioned entirely and refused to detonate. Police discovered it the following morning, preventing what could easily have been a catastrophic explosion in a busy area. In another case, shooters from the Young Turks faction staged an ambush against what they believed was one of Stanfa's key associates, but they had mistakenly identified the wrong man entirely. The innocent victim survived the shooting, but was left permanently traumatized by the experience of being attacked for no reason he could understand. Each of these failures had consequences that went well beyond the immediate tactical shortcoming. Every botched hit left behind a fresh trail of physical evidence for law enforcement investigators to follow. Surveillance cameras captured footage. Forensic teams recovered bullets and shell casings. And shocked witnesses who had been in the vicinity could potentially identify the shooters. Every failure also demonstrated to the opposing side that their enemies were fallible and capable of serious mistakes, which made both factions more willing to continue fighting rather than seeking any kind of negotiated accommodation. The endless and unrelenting violence took an enormous and grinding psychological toll on everyone caught inside it. Men on both sides lived in a state of constant fear and hypervigilance, always watching for threats in every direction, sleeping with loaded weapons within reach, completely unable to maintain anything resembling a normal and stable family life. Marriages fell apart under the crushing weight of the stress. Children grew up watching their fathers disappear for days at a time, and never knowing whether they would come home at all. Mothers aged years and months from worry and grief. For John Stanfa personally, the toll was heavier than most. His own son had been shot and disfigured because of choices he had made. His organization was fracturing visibly under the sustained pressure. The FBI was drawing the net tighter around him with every passing week, and the Young Turks he had tried to eliminate were showing absolutely no signs of backing down or breaking. He was trapped in a war he no longer had any realistic ability to win, but which he also could not walk away from without losing everything he had worked toward his entire adult life. The stress showed itself in increasingly erratic and unpredictable behavior from Stanfa. He became more withdrawn and isolated from even his most trusted people. His suspicion of everyone around him deepened to the point where it interfered with even basic decision-making. He became more and more dependent on his small circle of Sicilian enforcers as the only people he truly trusted. He made decisions driven by paranoia rather than sound strategic thinking, and repeatedly alienated potential allies through the way he treated them. The focused and disciplined boss who had arrived to take power in 1991 was becoming something much smaller and more frightened. A shadow of the man he had been, Joey Merlino, by striking contrast, seemed almost energized and strengthened by the ongoing conflict. He maintained his conspicuous public lifestyle, though now with trusted bodyguards never far from his side. He projected confidence and easy charisma in every public appearance, even as the legal and criminal pressures were mounting around him on all sides. Whether this performance reflected genuine inner confidence or was simply bravado deployed to mask real fear, it served its purpose of keeping his crew loyal and their morale high enough to keep fighting. The winter of 1993 into 1994 brought no reduction whatsoever in the intensity of the violence. If anything, both sides seemed to redouble their efforts, driven perhaps by a sense that the window for decisive action was closing, as law enforcement pressure steadily increased. Multiple significant shootings occurred in January and February of 1994, several of which made national news because of how completely brazen and openly they were carried out. In one widely reported incident, a drive-by shooting erupted outside a popular Italian restaurant in South Philadelphia. Bullets shattered windows and gouged deep marks into the building's brick facade. But by extraordinary luck, no one inside the packed restaurant was struck. The owner of that restaurant, caught helplessly between two warring mob factions with no way to satisfy either of them, eventually made the difficult decision to permanently close his business and leave the neighborhood entirely rather than wait for someone to be killed there. Another shooting played out at a traffic light in the middle of the afternoon, with the intended target saving his own life by throwing himself flat on the ground as bullets tore through every window in his car. Drivers in the adjacent lanes dove desperately for cover, thoroughly traumatized by the experience of suddenly finding themselves in the middle of a mob, war they had nothing whatsoever to do with. Each new incident brought a fresh wave of law enforcement attention, more media coverage, and more public pressure on city and federal officials to bring the whole thing to a definitive end. City officials held press conferences expressing outrage. Neighborhood associations organized community meetings to discuss the violence and demand action. The pressure on the FBI and the Philadelphia Police Department, too, end the mob war by any means necessary, became overwhelming and impossible to ignore. As 1994 progressed, more and more members of both factions began making the decision to cooperate with authorities. The FBI had absorbed and carefully applied the lessons of the Scarfo era. The most effective strategy for dismantling a mafia family was to work from the inside out, turn the soldiers against their bosses, get them on the record testifying about specific murders and specific racketeering activities, use their detailed insider knowledge to construct airtight RICO cases that would hold up completely in court. The strategy was producing results that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Men who had taken blood oaths and sworn their lives to La Cosa Nostra were lining up to testify against the very people they had called brothers. Some were cooperating to avoid spending the rest of their lives behind bars. Others did it because they were genuinely terrified for their physical safety and saw cooperation as their only realistic path to survival. A small number came forward out of genuine disgust and disillusionment with what the organization had become. Each cooperating witness provided additional pieces of a very large and complex puzzle, concrete details about specific murders, granular information about the organizational hierarchy and how orders flowed through it, and solid evidence of ongoing criminal enterprises that federal prosecutors could use to build their cases. By early 1994, federal prosecutors had reached the point where they believed they had sufficient evidence to indict the leadership of both factions on RICO charges that carried mandatory sentences of life imprisonment. The mob war that had terrorized Philadelphia for 3 years was approaching its end. Not because one side had managed to defeat the other militarily, but because the federal government was in the process of destroying both sides, simultaneously through coordinated and overwhelming prosecutions. On March 17, 1994, federal agents conducted a carefully coordinated series of simultaneous arrests that effectively and permanently ended the Philadelphia mob war as a functioning conflict. John Stanfa was taken into custody at his home, his son Joseph Jr. Still recovering from the injuries, he had sustained in the expressway ambush. Was arrested as well Sergio Battaglia, Frank Martins, and nearly 24 other members and associates of Stanfa's organization were picked up in a series of coordinated raids across the region. The indictment that was unsealed that day was a massive document, running to over 100 pages and detailing with precision a comprehensive catalog of murder. Attempted murder, racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, and criminal conspiracy charges. The government's formal allegation was that Stanfa had led a continuing criminal enterprise and had used systematic and organized violence as the primary tool for maintaining his control over the Philadelphia crime family and its various criminal activities. Specific charges in the indictment included the attempted murders of Joey Merlino and multiple members of his crew, the shooting of Michael Chung Shonkaglini Jr., multiple other completed murders and additional attempted murders, narcotics distribution operations, the extortion of legitimate businesses throughout the region, labor racketeering schemes within various trade unions, and a broad-ranging conspiracy to plan and commit violent crimes. The evidence supporting all of those charges was genuinely overwhelming in its scope and depth. The FBI had hundreds of hours of recorded conversations between Stanfa and his associates discussing criminal activity in explicit detail. Multiple cooperating witnesses had agreed to testify about crimes they had personally participated in alongside the defendants. Extensive physical evidence connected individual defendants directly to specific crime scenes. Financial records documented the flow of criminal proceeds through the organization, and comprehensive surveillance footage and photographs documented meetings and transactions that the defendants would have been very much happier had never been recorded. For John Stanfa, who had placed his faith throughout his life in the Sicilian code of Omerta as an absolute protection against ever being brought down by outsiders, the full scope of what the government had assembled against him must have been a genuinely staggering shock. Men he had trusted completely, men who had taken the same sacred oaths he had taken decades earlier, had lined up to testify against him one after another. The old ways, it turned out with brutal finality, simply could not survive the combination of decades-long federal prison sentences and the federal government's witness protection program. The government's case against John Stanfa was constructed on multiple reinforcing layers of evidence, each one lending strength and credibility to all the others, and together creating a prosecutorial picture that was extremely difficult to challenge effectively. First and most important were the cooperating witnesses themselves. John Veazey proved to be particularly and devastatingly effective for the prosecution. Over several full days of testimony, he described in careful and specific detail his participation in murder attempts that had been planned and ordered by Stanfa. He described the meetings he had personally attended where acts of violence were discussed and arranged. He provided detailed information about how the organization was structured and how it functioned on a day-to-day basis that could only possibly have come from someone who had been deeply embedded inside it. His testimony was credible in large part because he freely and completely admitted his own substantial criminal conduct and was clearly not attempting to minimize or excuse it in any way. He was already facing serious prison time, regardless of whether he cooperated. He had no obvious reason to fabricate testimony or exaggerate his knowledge. Other cooperators provided additional testimony that corroborated and reinforced Veazey's account from multiple independent perspectives. Some of these witnesses testified about specific criminal incidents they had personally been involved in. Others were able to describe in detail the organizational structure and the decision-making processes that governed how the family operated. Together, they created a comprehensive and deeply detailed, portrait of Stanfa's criminal enterprise that was extremely hard to dispute. The wiretap recordings were the second major pillar of the prosecution's case. Federal agents had obtained proper court authorization to monitor phones used by Stanfa and his closest associates. And the recordings they had captured contained conversations about criminal activity ranging from the carefully coded to the shockingly direct and explicit. Stanfa's own voice could be heard on multiple recordings, discussing what he called problems that needed to be permanently handled. Language that in context left very little room for innocent interpretation. Expert analysts were available to explain to the jury exactly what the coded terms meant in the specific context of the mob's internal communications. Third, physical forensic evidence connected specific members of Stanfa's organization to specific criminal acts. Ballistics analysis linked particular weapons to particular shootings. Surveillance footage placed defendants at crime scenes or at locations where conspiracies had been planned. Financial records documented the movement of criminal proceeds. Cell phone and telephone records established that known conspirators had been in direct communication with each other at the precise times when crimes were being organized and carried out. Fourth, the government called expert witnesses who were able to explain to the jury in clear and accessible terms how mafia families like the Philadelphia crime family actually operated, helping ordinary jurors understand the significance of the coded language they heard on the recordings, the meaning of the organizational titles and structures that were referenced, and the protocols and rituals that governed how decisions were made and carried out. The defense team that Stanfa retained was experienced and skilled, and they mounted the most vigorous defense that the available facts would permit. Their strategy rested on several main arguments. They attacked the credibility of the cooperating witnesses as aggressively and persistently as they possibly could, pointing out repeatedly that these men were admitted murderers and extortionists who had made favorable deals with the government in exchange for their testimony, and who therefore had powerful incentives to lie, to exaggerate, to tell prosecutors exactly what they wanted to hear, and to minimize their own roles in the crimes they described while maximizing Stanfa's. They fought hard to create reasonable doubt about the interpretation of the wiretap recordings, arguing that coded and ambiguous language could legitimately be understood in multiple different ways, and that prosecutors were reading criminal intent into conversations that might have referred to completely legitimate business matters. They tried to present Stanfa to the jury as a genuine and successful legitimate businessman who had been falsely and unfairly caught up in events that were beyond his control or his knowledge. They called witnesses to testify about his legitimate construction business and his food distribution operation, and tried to construct an alternative narrative in which he was being prosecuted for his past associations rather than for any genuinely criminal conduct in the present. And they argued that Stanfa was being held improperly responsible for violent acts committed by his associates, who had been operating on their own initiative rather than under his direct orders. The mafia, they suggested to the jury, was a loose and informal collection of independent criminals rather than the tightly hierarchical organization where the boss controlled and directed every significant action. It was a creative and professionally executed defense strategy, but it was not sufficient to overcome the evidence arrayed against their client. The pattern was too clear, the testimony too consistent across multiple independent sources, the physical evidence too direct, and the recordings too incriminating. After months of testimony from dozens of witnesses and days of careful deliberation by the jury, the verdict was delivered in November of 1995. John Stanfa was found guilty on virtually every count in the indictment: racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, murder in furtherance of racketeering activity, extortion, loan sharking, and a long list of additional charges all came back with guilty verdicts. His co-defendants were convicted as well on their respective charges, though a small number received mixed verdicts with acquittals on certain individual counts. For Stanfa himself, the verdict was as comprehensive and devastating as it could possibly have been. He had been formally found guilty by a jury of his peers of leading a violent criminal enterprise over an extended period of time. The sentencing hearing came several weeks after the verdict. Federal sentencing guidelines combined with the specific nature and severity of the charges in the indictment and Stanfa's extensive criminal history ensured that he was facing what was in practical terms a life sentence. The judge presiding over the case heard detailed arguments from both sides. Prosecutors argued passionately for the maximum possible sentences to reflect the true seriousness and scope of the crimes and to send the clearest possible message to anyone who might contemplate organizing similar violence in the future. Defense attorneys made their arguments for some degree of judicial mercy, pointing to Stanfa's age, which was now well into his mid-50s, his legitimate business activities, and the roles that other people had played in carrying out the actual violence. Their arguments, however thoughtfully made, carried very little practical weight against the full magnitude of the crimes that had been proven in court. Judge Franklin S. Van Antwerpen imposed multiple consecutive life sentences totaling more than 175 additional years, a sentence that guaranteed with mathematical certainty that John Stanfa would never under any circumstances be released from federal custody for any reason. His son Joseph Jr. received a substantially shorter sentence, but would still spend years of his young life locked away in a federal prison. A deeply tragic outcome for a young man who had been slowly and inexorably drawn into his father's world, against his own better instincts and inclinations. As the sentences were formally announced and recorded by the court clerk, Stanfa reportedly showed almost no outward emotion whatsoever. Perhaps by that point, he had already come to terms with the certainty of this outcome from the very moment of his arrest. Perhaps his deeply ingrained Sicilian pride simply would not allow him to show any vulnerability or weakness in front of the prosecutors and FBI agents who had worked for years to bring him to that moment. Or perhaps after everything that had happened over 3 brutal and exhausting years, he was simply too completely worn down and numb to feel anything strongly anymore. He was immediately taken back into federal custody and would soon be transported to a maximum security federal penitentiary to begin the process of serving out what were effectively multiple lifetime sentences. At 55 years of age, John Stanfa's life, as he had always known and lived, it was definitively and permanently over. The conviction of John Stanfa and the destruction of his organization brought an effective end to the Philadelphia mob war that had terrorized the city and its residents for 3 relentless years. With Stanfa and his entire Sicilian crew safely behind bars, there was no longer any organized faction remaining to oppose the Young Turks or contest their claim to whatever was left of the family's rackets and criminal operations. Joey Merlino, who had been indicted on somewhat lesser charges and eventually convicted of illegal gambling-related offenses, served a relatively short prison sentence compared to Stanfa. When he emerged from custody, he was positioned to take control of what remained of the Philadelphia crime family, which was by that point a mere shadow and distant reflection of what it had been in its prime years under Angelo Bruno. Years of sustained and brutal violence combined with relentless federal prosecutions had devastated its ranks beyond easy repair. Many of its most capable and experienced members were dead or locked away in federal prisons. The next generation of potential recruits had grown up watching the mob destroy itself from within and had drawn the obvious conclusion that a life in organized crime led primarily to prison, or an early grave rather than to wealth and power. The convictions also sent strong and clear signals throughout the broader American mafia world. The Philadelphia case demonstrated with absolute finality that RICO prosecutions combined with cooperating witnesses and modern surveillance technology could systematically dismantle even the most deeply established crime families. The ancient code of omerta that had kept mafia families protected from law enforcement for generations was genuinely and permanently dead. Men would now talk to save themselves, and each person who made that choice made it easier and more natural for the next person to do the same. The human cost of the entire episode was enormous and deeply sobering. More than a dozen people had been killed or seriously wounded in the mob war. Families had been torn apart in every sense of that phrase. A young man, Joseph Stanfa Jr., had been drawn into a life of crime by his father's choices, and would spend years of his youth behind bars. Entire neighborhoods had been traumatized by years of open warfare. Legitimate businesses throughout South Philadelphia had been victimized through extortion and had operated for years in an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. The full human price of John Stanfa's personal ambition was staggeringly and devastatingly high. John Stanfa was eventually transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, one of the oldest and most storied federal prisons in American history, before being moved through various other facilities as the Bureau of Prisons made its determinations about where he should be held. Life inside a federal maximum security prison is rigorously controlled and deeply harsh by any measure. Stanfa, a man who had spent years commanding others and having his orders followed without question, was now himself subject to the absolute and non-negotiable authority of correctional officers, who could not have cared less about his former status. He lived in a small cell and followed strict institutional schedules day after day. His contact with the outside world was tightly limited and closely monitored. His family could visit him, though the great distances between Philadelphia and wherever he happened to be housed at any given time made frequent visits difficult and expensive. His wife remained loyal for a time at least, though the sustained strain of having both a husband and a son serving prison sentences simultaneously was an almost incomprehensible burden to carry. His daughter made her best efforts to build a normal life for herself, though being publicly identified as the child of a convicted mob boss brought its own complicated set of challenges. In prison, Stanfa had enormous quantities of time to sit with his thoughts and reflect on the long chain of choices that had brought him from a quiet hillside village in Sicily to a federal prison cell in the American heartland. Did he feel genuine regret for what had happened? Did he ever wish sincerely that he had chosen differently at key moments along the way? Did he blame himself for what his choices had cost his son? These are questions that almost certainly cannot be answered with any confidence. Men who have lived their entire lives by the Sicilian code of strength and silence rarely, if ever, expose vulnerability or admit error, especially not to outsiders who are never part of their world. The code that had defined everything about his life demanded stoic acceptance and public strength even in, or especially in, the face of total defeat. What is beyond any question or doubt is that his imprisonment brought his story to its practical conclusion. Unlike certain mob bosses who have found ways to continue exercising meaningful influence and giving orders, even from inside federal prison, Stanfa had no organization left to lead. His top lieutenants were all behind bars alongside him. His imported Sicilian enforcers faced prison sentences and potential deportation. The Philadelphia family he had tried to rebuild and lead was effectively extinct as a functioning criminal organization. He was simply an aging man serving multiple life sentences and counting out the remaining days of his life. With Stanfa imprisoned and his organization dismantled beyond any realistic possibility of reconstruction, Joey Merlino gradually consolidated his position as the recognized boss of whatever remained of the Philadelphia crime family through the middle and late 1990s. It was a position he had quite literally fought and bled for through 3 years of open warfare. But what he inherited as his prize was a fraction of what the family had been at its peak under Angelo Bruno's steady leadership. Law enforcement estimates from around 1999 suggested that the Philadelphia family had perhaps 50 to 60 made members and active associates in total, compared to well over 100 during Bruno's era. Many of the most experienced and capable members were dead or locked away. The family's traditional criminal enterprises had been severely disrupted by years of violence and aggressive federal prosecution. Merlino's personal leadership style was a sharp and deliberate contrast to everything Stanfa had represented. Where Stanfa had been disciplined, careful, and deeply old-world in his approach, Merlino was flashy, publicly visible, and thoroughly modern in his sensibility. He enjoyed fine restaurants and upscale nightclubs, dressed expensively and with obvious attention to his appearance, and seemed genuinely to welcome the kind of media attention that every traditional mob boss would have considered deeply dangerous and deeply foolish. This approach brought Merlino certain real benefits, particularly in terms of his personal charisma and his ability to attract and retain younger recruits. But it also guaranteed him constant and intensive FBI surveillance. In 2001, Merlino was convicted on racketeering charges of his own and sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. He was released in 2011, only to be convicted again in 2018 on illegal gambling charges. The Philadelphia family, under Merlino's on-again, off-again leadership, has continued its long and irreversible decline. Federal prosecutions have steadily chipped away at its membership numbers. Younger generations have drawn the reasonable conclusion from watching what happened to their predecessors that mob life is a path to prison rather than to wealth, power, or respect. The traditional Italian-American neighborhoods that had been the mob's primary recruiting ground for generations have changed dramatically, with families relocating to the suburbs, an entirely new immigrant, communities moving into the areas that the mob once controlled. John Stanfa's complete story is, in many important ways, the story of the American Mafia's broader and irreversible decline, told through a single life and a single, catastrophic failure of leadership. The organization he joined as a young immigrant in the 1960s was powerful, financially stable, and deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of the cities it controlled. By the time he entered federal prison in the mid-1990s, it was a crumbling institution barely recognizable as a direct descendant of what it had once been. Multiple overlapping forces contributed to this decline, and it is worth briefly examining them to understand the full context of Stanfa's failure. The RICO Act, passed by Congress in 1970, gave federal prosecutors an entirely new and enormously powerful set of tools for attacking organized crime families as entire criminal enterprises, rather than simply prosecuting individual criminals for individual crimes. By establishing a pattern of racketeering activity, the government could convict not just the individual soldiers who committed specific crimes, but the bosses who had ordered and directed them. The breakdown of omerta, the sacred code of silence, fundamentally and permanently changed the equation for mafia families across the country. When men were no longer reliably bound by the old code, When the prospect of decades in federal prison made cooperation more attractive than silence, it became nearly impossible for any organization to operate safely. Every single member became a potential government witness. Modern surveillance technology, including sophisticated wiretapping capabilities, high-definition video cameras, GPS tracking devices, and powerful computer forensics tools, made it progressively more difficult for criminals to conduct their business without leaving a traceable record behind. The old practice of meeting in person and relying on facial expressions and coded language could not protect against the full capabilities of the modern FBI. Generational changes in the Italian-American community meant that the pool of willing recruits was shrinking with each passing decade. The second and third generation, descendants of the original immigrant communities, that had provided the mafia with its members for generations, now had legitimate educational and professional opportunities that their grandparents could not have imagined. College, professional careers, and upward social mobility made organized crime far less attractive as a life choice than it had been for earlier generations of poor immigrants with few other options. New criminal organizations from Russia, Asia, Albania, Mexico, and other countries moved aggressively into territories and criminal markets that the Italian-American mob had once controlled as exclusive monopolies. The mob's traditional strengths, its political connections, its control of specific industries and labor unions, its ability to project credible violence, became progressively less relevant in a rapidly changing economy and a changing city. The expansion of legal gambling, including large tribal casino operations and state lottery systems, eliminated much of the traditional bookmaking business that had been one of the mob's most consistent and reliable revenue streams for generations. When ordinary people could place legal sports bets or buy lottery tickets at the corner store, they had much less reason to seek out an illegal bookie. John Stanfa's determined attempt to lead the Philadelphia family using old world Sicilian methods and values ran directly and fatally into the full force of all these converging trends. He believed with deep and genuine conviction that traditional authority, backed by the threat of violence and supported by the Code of Omerta, would be sufficient to maintain control over his organization and defeat his enemies. He was catastrophically wrong about that. The world he was trying to recreate in 1990s Philadelphia had already been gone for years. The America he was trying to apply Sicilian traditions to was not the Sicily of his childhood, and it was not even the Philadelphia that Angelo Bruno had navigated so successfully in the 1960s and 1970s. It was a different country operating under different rules, and those rules were simply not compatible with the kind of leadership Stanfa was determined to provide. John Stanfa remains in federal custody to this day, serving his multiple consecutive life sentences, now well into his 80s. He is an elderly prisoner whose days of any kind of power or public significance are many decades behind him. He will almost certainly die inside a federal institution without ever having experienced a free day again. Joseph Stanfa Jr. served out his sentence and was eventually released from federal custody, returning to the difficult work of trying to rebuild a life for himself outside of organized crime, which is never a straightforward or easy task for anyone carrying the dual burdens of a mob background and a federal conviction. The physical and psychological marks of being shot in the face at 23 years old have remained with him as permanent and unavoidable, reminders of the price his father's ambitions extracted from their entire family. Joey Merlino, despite multiple federal convictions and years served in prison, remains a recognized and publicly known figure in the world of mob history and true crime media. Despite his age and his ongoing legal exposure, He represents the survival of the Young Turks faction that went to war with Stanfa for control of the family. Whether his survival constitutes any kind of meaningful victory is genuinely debatable. He has spent a substantial portion of his adult life in federal custody and continues to face potential legal consequences. Sergio Battaglia, Stanfa's most trusted and feared Sicilian enforcer, was convicted alongside his boss and received a lengthy federal prison sentence. Other members of Stanfa's organization either died in custody or were eventually released as elderly men with no functional organization to return to and no realistic prospect of rebuilding one. The Philadelphia crime family still exists on paper and in the formal classifications used by law enforcement, but it is an institution that exists largely in name only. Current law enforcement estimates suggest it may have 20 to 30 active members and associates engaged in small-scale gambling, loan sharking, and occasional extortion. It no longer holds a formal seat on the commission, which may itself no longer function in any meaningful sense. It is, for all practical purposes, irrelevant to both the broader criminal underworld and to the day-to-day priorities of law enforcement. What enduring lessons can be drawn from the full arc of John Stanfa's rise and fall? Several important themes emerge clearly from the complete story. Perhaps the most important is the impossibility of genuinely turning back time. Stanfa tried with everything he had to bring old-world Sicilian traditions and methods into a 1990s American city. He believed completely that the approaches that had worked in Cacamo or in Angelo Bruno's Philadelphia could still work in the age of sophisticated RICO prosecutions, court-authorized wiretapping, and cooperating federal witnesses. He was completely and catastrophically wrong, and his failure illustrates clearly that you cannot reverse fundamental social and legal changes through sheer force of will or the threat of violence. A second major theme is the devastating price of an inflexible and unchecked pride. Stanfa's deep Sicilian sense of personal honor and dignity simply would not permit him to compromise with the Young Turks in any meaningful way, to find creative paths to shared power, or to adapt his style of leadership to the people and the circumstances he was actually dealing with, rather than the idealized version of those things that existed in his imagination. His insistence on absolute authority and rigid adherence to traditional hierarchy made the mob war not just likely, but essentially inevitable. A more flexible and pragmatic leader might have found ways to coexist with, or at least neutralize the Young Turks without resorting to open warfare. Stanfa's pride made that kind of creative problem-solving impossible. The immense human cost of the entire episode is another theme that deserves to be kept clearly in view. The mob war killed and wounded many people, destroyed families of all descriptions, and left lasting scars on an entire community. Stanfa's personal ambition extracted an enormous price, paid not only by himself and his stated enemies, but by innocent family members, uninvolved bystanders, and entire neighborhoods that had no dog in the fight and no protection from the violence that erupted around them. A fourth theme is the fundamental futility of trying to solve organizational problems through violence. Stanfa genuinely and sincerely believed throughout the conflict that enough targeted and decisive violence would eventually solve his problems with the Young Turks, that by eliminating the right people, he could restore order and authority to his organization. Instead, the violence attracted precisely the kind of massive and determined law enforcement response that destroyed his entire operation. The mob war accomplished nothing positive for anyone involved and served primarily to accelerate the Philadelphia family's complete collapse. Finally, and perhaps most significantly of all, Stanfa's story provides the clearest possible illustration of the complete and permanent breakdown of the Code of Omerta. Men he had trusted implicitly, men who had taken the same sacred blood oaths he had lived by for decades, testified against him one after another in open federal court to reduce their own sentences. The traditional bonds of loyalty and brotherhood that had supposedly held mafia families together across generations turned out to be not just breakable, but remarkably fragile when subjected to the pressure of multi-decade federal prison sentences. John Stanfa arrived in America in 1964, carrying the dreams that millions of immigrants before him had carried across that same ocean. He built legitimate businesses, raised a family, and found a measure of success in his adopted country. But he also chose another path alongside that one, a path that wound through the ranks of the Philadelphia mob, all the way to the boss's chair, and then directly into a federal prison cell. His entire tenure as boss lasted barely 3 years in total, but in that brief and violent window of time, he managed to cause extraordinary damage to the organization he had claimed to want to restore and strengthen. The mob war he started and sustained killed more than a dozen people, generated massive law enforcement attention that had been deliberately avoided for years, and ultimately provided the prosecution with the evidence needed to put him and dozens of associates away for life. He tried to be a traditional Sicilian don in modern America, to rule by old world authority and strict hierarchical discipline, but the world he was trying to recreate had already ceased to exist long before he ever reached for the position of boss. The American mafia of the 1990s was not the Sicily of his childhood. It was not even the Philadelphia of Angelo Bruno's careful and profitable era. It was a dying and thoroughly compromised institution riddled with government informants, operating under constant sophisticated surveillance and completely unable to adapt to the changed legal and social landscape that surrounded it on every side. In the end, John Stanfa's story is not one of triumph or even of tragic near success. It is a story of irreversible failure and profound human tragedy. The tragedy of a man permanently out of step with his own time, holding desperately to traditions that no longer had any functional value, unable or unwilling to recognize that the world had fundamentally and permanently moved on without him. He sits now in a federal prison, an elderly man with nothing but time and memory. The hills of Sicily half a world away, the streets of South Philadelphia moving forward without him, and the mob he sacrificed everything to lead effectively extinct. From Cacamo to Philadelphia to a federal prison cell, John Stanfa's journey represents in concentrated and tragic form the rise and irreversible fall of the traditional Italian-American mafia. It is a story without a single genuine hero, a tragedy in which everyone loses in one way or another, and a powerful cautionary tale about the devastation that results from pride, from violence, and from refusing to accept that the past cannot be brought back through any amount of force or determination. The era he tried to preserve and restore is over. The young Turks who survived the war against him fell to their own federal prosecutions in the years that followed. The Philadelphia crime family they both fought over continued its long and inevitable decline into near irrelevance. The Sicilian don who tried to save it helped destroy whatever was left of it in the process of trying. On the streets of South Philadelphia today, careful observers can still find traces of what once was if they know exactly where to look. The social clubs where made men once gathered to conduct their business and settle their disputes are mostly gone now, replaced by the wine bars and specialty coffee shops that have arrived with the neighborhood's ongoing gentrification. The row houses where powerful mob figures once lived now sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars to young professionals who have no idea what happened inside those walls. The Italian restaurants where generations of deals were made over long meals still produce excellent food. But their regular customers are more likely to be food, writers and out-of-town visitors, and men with serious matters to discuss in quiet voices. The old-timers who personally remember Angelo Bruno's era, who lived through every terrible year of Scarfo's violence, and then through Stanfa's brutal war, are passing away with each year that goes by. With them goes the living institutional memory of what the Philadelphia mob actually was at its height. For younger residents of the neighborhood, the mob is genuinely ancient history now, something their grandparents might have had some distant connection to, as remote and abstract as Prohibition or the Second World War. But if you look carefully enough in the right places, the traces are still there. Bullet holes filled in, but still faintly visible in old brick walls. Intersections where men were shot down in the street, now busy and unremarkable, carrying no visible memory of what they witnessed. Cemeteries where the casualties of the mob wars rest under ornate Italian surname headstones, bearing dates from the brutal 1990s, and scattered across federal prisons throughout the country. Elderly men serving out life sentences for crimes they committed in a world that has since completely disappeared. John Stanfa is among them, an octogenarian prisoner whose moment of terrible power is receding further and further into history with every year that passes. The story of the Sicilian Don who lost Philadelphia is, at its deepest level, a very American story. It is about immigration and the collision between old world identity and new world reality. It is about ambition and the destruction that unchecked ambition can cause. It is about how violence ultimately destroys not just its intended targets, but the people who choose to wield it. And it is about the absolute impossibility of recovering the past through force, no matter how desperately or how violently we reach for it. John Stanfa wanted above all else to be remembered as a great boss, a leader of the Angelo Bruno mold, respected and quietly powerful. Instead, he is remembered as the Sicilian Don who lit the fuse on a bloody and pointless war that accomplished nothing of lasting value and destroyed everything it touched. He sits in a federal prison cell, an elderly man with decades of enforced solitude behind him and likely more ahead of him. And the streets of the city where he once commanded fear and respect have long since moved on without a backward glance. From Cacamo to Philadelphia, to a federal prison cell, the journey is complete, the accounting is done, and the verdict of history is clear. He sought power and found only destruction. He sought respect and found only fear followed inevitably by betrayal. He sought to restore something noble and lasting, and succeeded only in hastening the final collapse of the institution he claimed to serve. The Sicilian Don who lost Philadelphia will almost certainly die as he has spent these many years, behind bars, largely forgotten by the world outside, remembered chiefly by organized crime, historians and true crime enthusiasts, and the families of those who suffered the consequences of his choices. It was all, in the end, completely unnecessary. If Stanfa had possessed the flexibility and the wisdom to compromise, to work with rather than against the Young Turks, to adapt his leadership style to the people and the circumstances he actually faced, rather than the idealized situation he wished he faced, the mob war might never have happened at all. Lives would have been saved and families spared devastating grief. And John Stanfa himself might have lived out his remaining years as a successful, legitimate businessman, comfortable and respected within his community, rather than dying alone in a federal prison. Instead, his pride made compromise impossible. His commitment to a rigid and outdated hierarchy made the conflict inevitable. And his belief in violence as the ultimate solution brought only total catastrophe. His name takes its place in history, not as the great restorer of tradition he imagined himself to be, but as the man who finally and definitively extinguished what little remained of the Philadelphia mob's once formidable light. A cautionary tale about the cost of living in the past, the futility of solving human problems through violence, and the absolute and permanent price of pride. There are no winners anywhere in this story, no heroes, no redemption, and no satisfying resolution. There is only tragedy and loss, the slow death of a criminal institution that never should have existed in the first place, and the long and painful personal reckoning of a man who reached for everything and ended up with nothing at all.